Hi, my name is Didi. You are here to listen to a story, and it's not my story, at least not for now. So let's get into it. I will read for you with my best non-native English speaker voice, and at the best of my abilities, the story of Egosu, the African goddess of luck. It's about an hour read. I hope you will enjoy the story and find it as inspiring as I did. Let's get into it. I will relay the story as best as I can, for it's not a story that was written, but that was passed down by word of mouth from generation to generation. As I was searching for my roots, looking for something to hold on to, Egosu found me. This is the story of Egosu, the African goddess of luck. It is said in the tradition that one does not find luck, luck finds you. This is the story of a boy that luck has found and to whom luck has smiled upon. His parents called him Kekeli, which meant stars, because of his eyes and because he was born on the day of a very rare event, a solar eclipse that lasted longer than anyone from memory. The same way that the eclipse plunged the village in silence, he also came to the world in silence, with his big, bright yellow eyes wide open. When babies are born, they are screaming and gesticulating, and African babies do not have yellow eyes. From the beginning, he was different, but it is said he was the most beautiful and healthy-looking baby the midwives have seen in a long time. There should have been happiness and cheers, but the circumstances were too strange, and tragedy was brewing on the other side of the village. There were two newborns on that mysterious day. On the other side of the village, the youngest wife of the king was also giving birth. Abla was young and fierce, loved by everyone. Because the eclipse was long and nobody knew when the sun was finally going to come out again, the villagers had to light up their torches. Her room was crowded with midwives going in and out to report her condition to the king and make sure he was not missing anything. The king was getting old. He had many wives and many daughters. But even though some of his daughters were already getting married to neighboring princes, he still had no son of his own, and he was expecting Abla to give him one. In the midst of labor, during the total eclipse, tragedy struck. One of the torches on the wall fell right into a jar full of scented oil on the floor underneath it. Flames burst out with thick and heavy smoke. Everyone was panicking. In the middle of labor, the queen had to be moved. A strong wind from the west rose and started feeding the fire. Sparks started to jump from straw roofs to straw roofs, and in the blink of an eye, the south court was blazing in flames, which, because of the strong wind, was spreading to roofs beyond the palace. The village had not seen such an event in a long time. The casualties were heavy. More than 30 people lost their lives that day. The granaries were damaged and some of the livestock was lost. The queen gave birth to a daughter, but in the process, because of the intoxication from the smoke, lost her life. The king was not pleased. He had enough daughters, and the times ahead, because of the loss of lives and resources, were obviously going to be hard. He needed to be sure a man from his bloodline will grow to whom he could pass the throne. The queen's daughter was named Mawena, in Ewe language meaning it is what God gave, as a sign of resignation from the king. Mawena was still a newborn and needed to be breastfed. Amid all the things that needed to be done in the days following the fire, all the women who were breastfeeding also came to the palace in order to replace Abla, but none were chosen by the young child. For 3 days, Mawena kept crying and refused to be breastfed by any of the women that came. Finally, it was noted that there was another woman that gave birth on that fateful day, but she was not like the other women of the village. Not just her, but both her husband and their newborn were different. Kekeli's mother was a tall woman with elegant lines. She could have certainly been amongst the most beautiful women in the village if she did not have completely white skin and orange hair. She was an albino, a rare skin condition that, in that era, was considered a curse from the goddess of beauty onto people who wanted to surpass her. Nonetheless, if the child was to survive, the king had no choice but to call upon her. The king had never seen her, but he had heard of a strange couple living outside the borders of the village. It was said that they could listen to plants and hear the song of nature. The man was not from the village, but he settled there after falling in love with Kekeli's mother. He looked strong, but he was missing an arm and his right eye. He was also covered in scars, and it was rumored that he had been one of the generals of a great army from the north that made defeats about 2 decades ago. Many villagers came to them for their knowledge of plant-based mixtures and medicines to heal the wounds of the body and to elevate the spirits. They were known as Egosu, plant masters. Kekeli's mother was brought to the palace on the same day, and for the first time, the cries of Mawena subsided. She had finally chosen her surrogate mother, and the king and his people could finally find some peace and quiet once again. For the first night since she came into this world, the baby princess finally fell asleep with a full tummy. Kekeli's mother, being versed in the virtues of plants, also concocted several potions that could ensure the baby would quickly regain all the strength she lost during her first few days. Since she came, the king did not have time to meet her, but finally, after a couple of days of hearing that Mawena was gaining in height and weight, he finally decided to meet that woman who saved her daughter's life. The king had a cup in his hand when Kekeli's mother entered the vast hearing room. He looked at her with a puzzled face. He could not quite determine if she was beautiful, but anything else than ugly. He never saw that kind of beauty before and didn't quite know how to categorize her. Kekeli's mother bowed and waited to be spoken to. The king drank from the cup and extended it to her. It was a great sign of appreciation, since only the ones favored by the king could drink in the same cup as him. Kekeli's mother, understanding the favor, bowed low and drank from the cup. It had been a long time since the king felt so relaxed in the presence of a female. He asked Kekeli's mother many questions, to which she answered politely, but with a refreshing sense of humor that contrasted with serious faces that the king was used to every day. The conversation lasted for 2 or 3 hours before the king finally dismissed her. Since that meeting, it was like something rekindled in the king's eyes. He started smiling again. Months and years passed, and both Kekeli and Mawena grew each day a little bigger, a little stronger. Every day Kekeli's mother came to the palace to attend to the little princess, who was attached to her as if she were her birth mother. And every day that she came to the palace, the king always requested that she spend some time in his service, chatting about current news with her while she served the meal. It was apparent that the king appreciated her company, but none said anything. Everyone was silently watching to see how things would unfold. The king knew that she was married and that she had a son. In the early years, in order to be able to spend some time taking care of her son also, Kekele's mother requested to bring him to the palace when she came to take care of the princess. The king agreed, and since then both children grew together. You will walk in front of a door and hear a kid laughing and chatting as if she was not alone. And when you look into the room, indeed she was not alone. But the second kid will be on the ground playing with a wooden doll, smiling, but in total silence. It was a weird thing to see from a kid, but since his birth, no one has ever heard Kekele speak. He gave sign of being quite intelligent. He learned quickly, drew like no other, was always smiling, but never uttered a word. Since the year of the eclipse, things have gone from bad to worse. In the year of the eclipse, the village had to fight the great fire that destroyed several houses and caused loss of lives. In the next year, rain came late and sparingly. The harvest that year was meager, which was another woe added to an already low food stock. In the third year, the rain came on time and the harvest was good. But not long after the harvest, and when the granaries were once again full, a disease fell on the village. This time, it was the livestock that died, the goats, the sheep, and especially the pigs. Within less than 2 months, the village lost more than 60% of their livestock. Then came the 4th year. After the death of the animals, it was the humans' turn. It seemed like the disease had mutated from animals to men. Some villagers started catching some strong fever, followed by headaches and uncontrollable shivers. Within a few days of the symptoms, the sick person will start having repetitive seizures, and soon after that, cardiac arrest will ensue. In that 4th year, even the king got sick. And it was the treatment developed by Kekele's parents and his mother attending to the king every day and night that finally saved him and curbed the spread of the disease within the village. The king's people were getting restless. 4 years of wars, one after the other. The villagers felt there had to be a reason, but there was still hope that next year will be better. But next year was not better. The 5th year came with a drought. The main river that supplied water to the village and its surrounding became thinner than a stream, its bank bare naked to the eyes of the Almighty Sun. Indeed, that year, the sun shined in all of its might, keeping away any hope of rain. Once again, the shadow of famine was upon the village. The 3 years that followed were the hardest the villagers had ever lived, even in the memory of the now very few elders alive. With drought came famine, with famine came despair. The children, getting close to their teens, could see that life became increasingly difficult. There were fewer people in the palace, and the king was always in a terrible mood. One evening, as Mawena was learning to weave with Kekele's mother, the king came into the room and closed the door. His eyes were red, and it looked like he had drunk. Kekele was sleeping in a corner of the room, unaware of what was going on. The king walked toward Kekele's mother, and in front of the little princess, stretched his hand into Kekele's mother's hair, saying, "I have long desired you. Today, you will give me a son." He pushed himself onto Kekele's mother, trying to kiss her. Kekele's mother couldn't scream because he was the king after all. Kekele woke up because of the agitation and was paralyzed in a silent terror. The king kept trying to kiss his mother, holding her with one hand and trying to tear her top with the other. He could see that his mother was frightened and trying to push back. But again, he was the king after all. The princess was terrified and could not understand what the king was doing. She only sensed that her mother was in danger. The struggle between the two kept going, and the king, in a fit of rage, slapped Kekele's mother so hard that she fell onto the floor. He then calmly walked to her, tore the clothes she tied to her waist, revealing her tights and underwear, and started removing his own. She did not struggle anymore. She just lay there, looking at him with tears in her eyes. At that moment, Mawena didn't know what came over her. With her little hand, she grabbed the biggest water jar in the corner of the room and threw it with all her strength toward the king's head. It was a perfect hit. The king tottered a bit and collapsed onto the floor. Everyone was shocked in silence. Kekele's mother was the first one to regain her senses. She rushed toward the king to check his situation. There was blood gushing out of the back of his head, but fortunately, the wound was not too deep. The rain came on time and the harvest was good. But not long after the harvest, and when the granaries were once again full, a disease fell on the village. This time, it was the livestock that died. The goats, the sheep, and especially the pigs. Within less than 2 months, the village lost more than 60% of their livestock. Then came the 4th year. After the death of the animals, it was the humans' turn. It seemed like the disease had mutated from animals to men. Some villagers started catching some strong fever, followed by headaches and uncontrollable shivers. Within a few days of the symptoms, the sick person will start having repetitive seizures, and soon after that, cardiac arrest will ensue. In that 4th year, even the king got sick, and it was the treatment developed by Kekele's parents and his mother attending to the king every day and night that finally saved him and curbed the spread of the disease within the village. The king's people were getting restless. 4 years of wars, one after the other. The villagers felt there had to be a reason, but there was still hope that next year will be better. But next year was not better. The 5th year came with a drought. The main river that supplied water to the village and its surrounding became thinner than a stream, its bank bare naked to the eyes of the Almighty Sun. Indeed, that year, the sun shined in all of its might, keeping away any hope of rain. Once again, the shadow of famine was upon the village. The 3 years that followed were the hardest the villagers had ever lived, even in the memory of the now very few elders alive. With drought came famine, with famine came despair. The children, getting close to their teens, could see that life became increasingly difficult. There were fewer people in the palace, and the king was always in a terrible mood. One evening, as Mawena was learning to weave with Kekele's mother, the king came into the room and closed the door. His eyes were red, and it looked like he had drunk. Kekele was sleeping in a corner of the room, unaware of what was going on. The king walked toward Kekele's mother, and in front of the little princess, stretched his hand into Kekele's mother's hair, saying, "I have long desired you. Today, you will give me a son." He pushed himself onto Kekele's mother, trying to kiss her. Kekele's mother couldn't scream because he was the king after all. Kekele woke up because of the agitation and was paralyzed in a silent terror. The king kept trying to kiss his mother, holding her with one hand and trying to tear her top with the other. He could see that his mother was frightened and trying to push back. But again, he was the king after all. The princess was terrified and could not understand what the king was doing. She only sensed that her mother was in danger. The struggle between the two kept going, and the king, in a fit of rage, slapped Kekele's mother so hard that she fell onto the floor. He then calmly walked to her, tore the clothes she tied to her waist, revealing her tights and underwear, and started removing his own. She did not struggle anymore. She just lay there, looking at him with tears in her eyes. At that moment, Mawena didn't know what came over her. With her little hand, she grabbed the biggest water jar in the corner of the room and threw it with all her strength toward the king's head. It was a perfect hit. The king tittered a bit and collapsed onto the floor. Everyone was shocked in silence. Kekele's mother was the first one to regain her senses. She rushed toward the king to check his situation. There was blood gushing out of the back of his head, but fortunately, the wound was not too deep. The dexterity of someone who has looked after many wounded and sick patients, she picked up a small knife under her dress and shaved the edge of the wounds before cleaning it with fresh water. She then took a small container with a green mixture in it and applied it generously on the wound before wrapping the king's head in a clean cloth. She turned to the children and asked them to help her drag the king and lay him on the bed. With the king now lying in bed unconscious, she turned to Mawena and hugged her tightly with tears in her eyes. She said, "My child, Mother thanks you for protecting her. Please, never regret your action today, because it is the greatest proof of love that you could give me in this lifetime. I will have to leave now, but a mother cannot live without leaving something behind to bless and protect her beloved child. My child, open your hands. I will give you 3 talismans that you should never depart with. The first one should have been given to you by your mother when you came of age. These 2 intertwined wines are called Lily. They are love and cooperation. May your life be filled with the love you deserve, and may you as a queen bring your people together under one goal. This piece of turtle shell is from me. It's called Tutu. It is health and longevity. I will not be here to see you grow into the beautiful woman I see in my dreams, but Tutu will be with you, ensuring that you grow old and healthy to pass down my blessing to your generations as well. Finally, this cowrie. I was holding on to it for Kekele, but I am giving it to you. Its name is Nini. And as you know, it means money and prosperity. May your life be filled with abundance, and may you bring wealth to our people. We might not meet again, my child, but Mother thanks you and loves you always." After saying those words, she bent her head and kissed the forehead of the princess, stayed silent for a few minutes in a prayer to the ancestor, then took Kekele's hand and left the room. Before she left, she gave the ointment to her daughter and instructed her to remain by the side of the king. The room was a mess, and Mawena thought as well. She was too young to realize the gravity of the situation. Shedding the blood of the king meant death. He was the king after all. The king woke up a couple of hours after the incident, groaning and furious. He had a vague memory of the events, but he knew he was at fault. Right in front of his daughter and 2 children in the room, he forced himself on a woman, and his own child crashed a jar onto his head to protect her mother. The feeling of humiliation was stronger than logic. He was the king after all, and someone had to pay. And he was obviously not going to be his daughter. The villagers sensed that the palace was more agitated than usual, but no one knew what happened. That night, the king's first wife requested a private hearing with him. Even though nowadays she only had formal relations with the king, who preferred younger faces, she was still the one that knew him the most, and behind the scene was managing the delicate affairs of the kingdom. She was there the day when the king gave his cup to Kekeli's mother, a gesture that was reserved to honored guests and the king's inner circle, and she knew since that day that something will happen. Something will undoubtedly happen. And the day was upon them now. Prior to the hearing, she summoned Mawena to get the details of the incidents and prepare a strategy. The king's wives never liked Kekeli's mother. She was too different. And without being from the inner circle, she had too much of the king's attention. This was an opportunity to kill two birds with one stone. When the king entered the king's chamber, she had a sense of nostalgia. The thick wooden pillars supporting the roof, the colorful tapestry on the walls. It's been a long time since she set foot into that place. A time when she not yet had these wrinkles lining the corners of her eyes, and her waist commanded the stare of all the men in the village, the king included. But that was the past, and every generation bred women more beautiful than the last. The king was allowed to grow old in power, but they, the women, could only grow old while holding the reins of power from the shadows. But nonetheless, most men were easy enough to manipulate if you knew where to touch. The king was seated in one of the many cushions on the floor with a bandage around his head. He looked old and tired. He asked her with an irritated voice what she wanted. The queen bowed and spoke. "My king, there is fear and despair in the heart of the people. Since that fateful day many years ago, when darkness captured the light of day, it seemed that even though the light came back, the darkness stole from us the favors of the God. We have endured calamities after calamities, sickness, drought, and a kingdom with no heir." The king's face hardened. The queen knew her life was hanging on her next words. She continued saying, "I slept with the river last night, and the water spoke to me. There is a way for prosperity to come back, but the gods are asking for a life. It's been a long time since we have performed Agbe Aloiku, the lottery of fortune. I am willing to make the pot of fortune from the clay of the sacred river. As per the tradition, the pot will be in the center of the village. Each family will engrave its symbol on a tree bark and put it in the pot. On the next full moon, and with the moon as witness, I volunteer to drink the elixir of sight and let the gods choose from the pot through my hands the name of the family that will bear our sins in an offering to them. My king, I am aware that this is an ancient tradition and that lives are precious, but it is because they are precious that only a sacrifice through Agbe Aloiku can save us. Our people will undoubtedly understand that it is an honor for them if they're chosen to carry the sin of their fellow brothers and save the village from additional hardships. And in my dreams, in between the arms of the river, she told me to tell you that Agbe Aloiku will avenge you." As she said those last words, the king understood. He lowered his head a little bit to avoid meeting her eyes and said with a small voice, "Go, Do as the gods have instructed." The king bowed, turned, and left swiftly. She had won. The villagers woke up to a strange scene, something they've only heard of in stories about the distant past and forgotten customs. There was a small pot made of white clay with a red ribbon around it placed in the center of the village. Even in that time of desperation, in the mornings you could hear some giggles here and there in the village. A couple of girls in a corner brushing each other's hair, a child or two running behind a lizard. But that morning was different. The air was heavy with the silence of a misfortune about to unfold. Soon after the morning ablutions, the king's messengers started beating their gongs in the village. To each head of the household, a piece of tree bark taken from the sacred forest was given, with the instruction of engraving their family symbol on it and placing it before sunset in the pot of fortune. The next morning, the whole village was instructed to gather around the pot. The king was seated impassive, surrounded by his court. When it was signaled that everyone was gathered, the heads of households, members of the king's courts, each stood up and walked to the pot of fortune to put the tree bark with their family symbol in it. The king's messenger then, looking at all the faces present, asked with an ominous voice if every household had complied. The crowd whispered something which could be interpreted as a yes. The queen waved her hand to call the messenger and whispered something in his ears. The messenger turned back to the villagers and asked if anyone had seen the family that lived on the outskirts of the village put their tree bark in the pots. The villagers initially did not even think about them because they never really considered them as part of their community. But this time, it seemed that their sense of community was large enough to encompass them, and even demand that they also comply with the rule. Thus, they were summoned to comply. As they arrived, Kekele's father went to the pot holding his wife's hands, but it was Kekele's mother who put the tree bark in the pot. And as she was doing so, she stared at the king and said, "The gods are always watching." The king could not but lower his head slightly and avoid her eyes. There was a murmur in the crowd. The king's reaction seemed to have confirmed the latest gossip in the village around a woman who defended herself against the king. Almost instantly, the atmosphere became lighter. People intuitively understood the play that was being acted in front of them. It was most probably titled "The King's Vengeance." At that moment, the queen got up and took a tree bark placed on a small plate in front of the king. She showed it to the people before putting it in the pot of fortune, saying that this was the symbol of the royal family and that no one was above the rules. She continued with the story that she slept with the river and the water told her that only Agbeyaluiku, this ancient ritual, can save the village from the many years of hardship and misery that it has faced. She said that 3 days from now, on the next full moon, she will take it upon herself to drink the sacred elixir and let the gods choose through her hands the family that will wash away the sins of the village. That no one should be afraid, quite the contrary. Each family should hope to be the chosen ones, because is there a greater honor than to be chosen by the gods to bring back luck to one's brothers and sisters? There was a whisper of approval that went through the crowd. Everyone knew they were not concerned, therefore they approved. And if by the greatest of luck the queen was right, it will definitely be a small loss for huge gain. The night of the full moon came, and once again the whole village gathered to play their parts in the tragedy that was being unfolded. The tradition stated that the family that will be selected will undergo the blessing ritual for 3 days, and on the third day, with the sun at its zenith, 3 members of the family will drink the sacred potion that will bring their souls to the gods and walk with the sins of the village into the sacred forest to never come out again. The queen was wearing a long white robe with a dark red ribbon around her waist. She gave the image of someone who resigned herself to an unpleasant but necessary task. After a short speech and custom prayers, she was handed a bowl filled with a strange translucent mixture that she had brought to her mouth and drank to the last drop. Then sat in front of the pot of fortune. Suddenly, the sounds of drums began, and with them, her body started jerking back and forth. It was as if she was battling something that wanted to take possession of her body. She jerked herself up with her head stretched toward the sky, threw her arms in the air and started convulsively dancing to the rhythm around the pot. At the highest moment of the scene, she let out a piercing cry, and within an instant she fell on the ground with one hand inside the pot. Everyone was silent, and even if the villagers felt like they could guess the name that would be picked, there was still a sense of unease in the air. What if it was their family? The queen got up silently and removed her hand from the pot with a tree bark in it. She waved to the king's messenger, who quickly came bringing with him the torch he had in his hand. Instead of giving him the tree bark, the queen took the torch from his hand, got up from the ground, and drew the family symbol that was supposedly on it in the sand, and immediately put it back in the pot before setting the pot on fire. The fire that rose from the pot revealed the symbol on the ground. It was Kekeli's family's symbol. You could hear people whispering to each other as per the ritual. You could hear people whispering to each other. As per the ritual, after the family symbol selected was drawn in the sand, the tree bark will be passed around the village for everyone to see before being put back in the pot and burned. That part of the ritual has been blatantly omitted. But then again, who dared raise their voice? As long as their family was safe, each individual kept silent. One of the elders got up with a blanket and covered the queen's shoulder with it. He then turned to the people and said that it was a great responsibility that the queen took upon her, because as it was passed down by the tradition, the gods could not be tricked, and if an injustice had happened, they themselves will enact justice. A murmur of consent and relief came from the crowd. The villagers' minds were appeased because the words of the elders discharged them from being an accomplice in an injustice and transferred the responsibilities to the gods. If the gods wanted justice, they could just execute it themselves. The blessing ritual was a special moment during which each family in the village will request to come and pay their respect to the chosen family. They will come with food and gifts as offerings in the hope of getting in exchange the blessing of the chosen family. Some families even came with their virgin daughters, and both women and men came to offer their bodies as gifts to the males and females of the chosen families. It was believed that as they were chosen by the gods, the chosen family's body became the embodiment of luck and good fortune. Ultimately, everything that could be done to make the chosen family's last day extremely enjoyable was done, because the fear was that they will go to the gods and instead of pleading for the village, they could complain and increase the village's woes. Agbealoiku was a double-edged sword. Thus, in the morning of the first day of the blessing ritual, the field in front of Kekele's parent house was filled with people, including messengers from the courts, waiting to demonstrate all their appreciation and attend to all their needs. After some time, Kekele's father got out with a message. All the villagers should leave and take their gifts with them. The family requested it spend its last hours together in communion, and on the day of the ceremony, they will address the village. There were whispers in the crowd, but no one dared to speak. After all, their lives were spared, and they could only hope that the chosen family will be better human beings than them and not hold a grudge. To the onlookers, Kekele's family seemed to have spent those few days relatively the same as always. The father spent time in the garden taking care of his plants, the mother on the porch weaving or cooking. Kekele was, as usual, focused with a piece of charcoal in his hands, drawing animal forms on the side of the family's house. Each morning, together they sat on the porch to watch the sun rise, and in the evening, together they watched the sunset. There was no sorrow in the faces, so much so that the villagers started to feel deep regret and remorse about the whole thing. In all fairness, Kekele's family has never done anyone wrong, quite the contrary. Their knowledge and their selfless dedication has saved many lives during the past couple of years. But just because of the foolish actions of the royal family, the village was going to lose an important asset. Inevitably, the day came and the villagers gathered at the edge of the sacred forests. The air was heavy with sadness and solemnity. Kekele's family arrived, soberly dressed and holding hands. They walked dignified and smiling in contrast with the fate that awaited them and the people gathered around. There was a white clay pot on the ground with a red ribbon around it and 3 small cups close to it. Kekele's family walked past the king, the queen, the court, and went straight to the pot. There, they turned to the people, and their eyes, intently staring at the king and the queen, Kekele's father spoke. We bear no grudge. Indeed, for more than 7 years now, Mother Nature seems to be against us. Is it our fault, or is there a war raging in the heavens to which we are only collateral damage? The mysteries of the world are profound and beyond our understanding. Agbealoiku is the ultimate sacrifice established by our forefathers and intended to select the ones who will plead the cause of the village in front of the gods. Have we been chosen by the hands of men or gods? It does not matter, for we bear no grudge. In a time of crisis, when there is the need for hope, we accept to be the bringers of hope, and we assure you all today that we will plead to the gods for their benevolence and compassion upon the village. We have lived through many seasons, and in each we felt joy, sorrow, pain, and hope. Every season came with new challenges and opportunities, but every time, the palette of feelings to experience the uniqueness of the world remained the same, and each time we have lived fully and courageously. There are no feelings we have not felt. Thus, there is nothing left for us to experience. Our only regret is that our beloved son will not have experienced as many seasons as us. But then again, He will come with us to meet the gods. Therefore, he will never have to experience the wickedness of man. Thus, as we depart, we bear no grudge. We will fulfill the duty that fate has assigned to us. May through our sacrifice, abundance and prosperity come back to the village, for everything has been forgiven. The gods are always watching. Having spoken, Kekele's father picked up the pot and filled all 3 cups to the brim. He picked up his son and kissed him on the forehead before putting the cup to his lips and instructing him to drink everything. His wife got closer, kissed their son as he was drinking, and picked up a cup also. She looked at him and said, "I am proud to have been your wife." They passionately kissed, and she drank her cup. He smiled and drank his, holding his son with his arm, his wife's arm around his waist. All 3 of them, having drunk the poisonous mixture, turned their back to the village and started walking toward the sacred forests. They had less than an hour to find their final resting place. As they walked, the drums started beating hard. The villagers were not singing. They were literally screaming their gratitude to their saviors. At that point, their feelings were just too much to be expressed in an orderly fashion. The first indication that he was conscious was that his tummy was growling, which usually happens when he was really hungry. He smelled roasted chicken in the air. That was quite a surprise because meat was so rare that the few times he tasted chicken was during the harvest festival. And lately the harvests have been so bad that there wasn't anything much to celebrate. Kekele opened his eyes to a straw roof on top of his head. He was expecting a little bit more of a grandiose welcome from the gods than a straw roof and the smell of chicken in the air. He tried to get up, but was pulled back to bed by a violent pain in his stomach. He remembered that his parents told him that all 3 of them had to become the village messengers to the gods and try to appease them so they could bless the village again. That in 3 days, they were going to drink a special potion that will elevate their souls to see the gods, and that whatever happens, he should not be afraid, because they will always be with him and protect him. He remembered to have smiled and nodded. He wasn't really the talkative type anyway, nor the type to be afraid. He always felt that with a little effort he could talk, but the world was already filled with so much empty noise that he never felt the urge to add his to it. He could hear a female voice humming not too far, and knew it was not his mother's. Now, the voice was getting closer. He knew he was in an unfamiliar place, but he didn't feel any danger, quite the contrary. So he waited for things to unfold. A woman came into the room with a steaming bowl in her hand. Kekele knew that her mother's beauty was different, but he had never seen a face like this woman's before. She had a white forehead with signs and symbols that seemed to be sculpted in her skin. She was slim and tall, with a bust and a hip so perfectly proportionated that it made the little man in him wake up. Her gaze was as piercing as that of a painter, even though he never saw one. Everything about her was rebellious but calm, furious but gentle. She smiled at him, and her smile made him burst into tears. At that moment, he intuitively knew that everything about his past was gone, and he only had the future to look up to. The king turned to Kekele and asked, "My son, what do you suggest we do?" King Togbechali had many biological sons, but he only referred to as son or daughter individuals whom, according to him, are contributing the most to the good fortune and prosperity of the village. Being called son or daughter by the king was thus one of the highest honors sought by all the subjects, and Kekeli, for more than a decade now, was known as the king's favorite son, whose advent into the village, in by itself, triggered the beginning of a golden era. Many years ago, in his younger days, the king set out for a hunting expedition. The harvest that season was not great. The number of cattle heads was at its lowest point, and everyone could feel the shadow of famine looming over the village. That was the situation when a report came to the king informing him that a herd of antelope was spotted at 4 days' run northeast of the village. And if a hunting party could set out quickly, there was hope for a good hunt. The king and its men departed immediately. The information proved to be accurate, and the herd of antelope was still leisurely grazing in the surrounding clumps of grass. The party quickly set up a strategy and began the hunt, but unknown to them, they weren't the only predators around. As the king and its men were slowly approaching the antelopes, a pack of lions, quietly hidden in the tall grass, attacked them from the rear. It was unusual for wild animals to attack men with such ferocity, but probably their survival instinct was heightened by the fact that even in the savannah, food was becoming increasingly rare. The two species fought a fierce battle, but the king's party suffered the heaviest losses, including the king himself, who was gravely wounded. At that point, the hunting party needed to decide if they were going to return to the village or try to catch up with the antelopes. Even though he lost some men and was wounded himself, the king decided that the party should seek to catch up with the antelopes, because going back wounded and empty-handed would only aggravate the already low spirits of the villagers. Thus, the party set out to find the traces of the antelopes. However, within 2 days, the king started to have a high fever, and it was obvious that his wounds was infected. The party's healer was unfortunately among the men that had fallen, and the little that the remaining men knew of healing plants was not having the desired result. The men were far from home, with no hint of where their next meal will come from. And on top of that, their king was dying. The situation was desperate. That night, as the hunters were getting ready to sleep, one of them saw a young man walking toward them. He was tall and muscular, and was moving as quietly as a phelan in the night. Everyone got up with their spears ready in case the newcomer was an enemy. Kekeli walked to the fire in the middle of the camp and pointed to the king and the wounded and said, "I came to heal them." The hunter's language was one of the many popular languages in the region, and Kekeli knew a few words. The eldest in the group walked up to him and asked him what his name was and which village he came from. He gave his name and said that he was a traveling healer. He was passing nearby and saw traces of what seems to be a fierce fight. He guessed that there might still be people around that might need his skill. Thus, he followed the hunter's traces, which led him to them. It was now up to them to believe him or not. At that point, the hunters were too tired to doubt and chose to believe that he was sent to them by the goddess of fortune. They allowed Kekeli to tend to the wounds of the king as well as that of the other men, which he successfully did to everyone's surprise and happiness. The king had one true gift, and was his ability to read people's words. Only after a couple of minutes of interacting with Kekeli, he knew the extreme value of the men he had in front of him. Since he had been able to track them, the king asked Kekeli if he would be able to track the herd of antelopes, to which he replied, yes. In the following days, the party recuperated and got back to the hunt under the guidance of Kekeli. Not only did he lead them to the herd, but he also devised a strategy that enabled the party to kill many antelopes. As he was going to leave, he also taught them a novel process to dry the meat in order to preserve it for a longer period of time. In front of so many accomplishments in such a short period of time, the king pleaded to Kekeli to come to his village and help him save his people. Initially, Kekeli refused, but something on the king's forearm drew his attention. It was the tattoo of the face of a woman smiling. Kekeli asked him about the story behind the tattoo, and the king said that many decades ago, his people were under the rule of an evil king. But through an elaborate scheme, he was able one night to escape with a couple hundred people who were also tired of living under the evil king's oppression. They escaped together through the mountains, but since they weren't too familiar with the terrain, they found themselves trapped in a dead end with the king's soldiers on their rear. That night, he could not sleep because he sharply felt that his actions brought the impending death of many hundred people. As he was walking through the camp and giving hope to his people, he met on the outskirts a woman with a peculiar and unfamiliar face. She was trying to move a boulder to let her small herd of goats pass through the valley. The king had a deep belief that one should be good to all living beings and treat everyone with kindness. So, he helped the lady move the boulder, then told her that unfortunately she has gotten herself into a dead end. The lady looked at him, smiled, and said, "You are a good man. Follow me." She led him through a narrow crevice in the mountain that was practically invisible to anyone who did not know about it. The crevice was a natural path that led to the other side of the mountain. At that moment, the king knew that his people were saved. The woman told him that she would wait for him to lead his people through. In excitement, he went back to the camp to bring his people through, but as he got to the other side of the mountain, he searched everywhere, but the woman was nowhere to be found. He got down to his knees, pressed his head onto the ground, and thanked the goddess of fortune. The only thing he remembered from her savior was her enchanting smile, and he wanted that smile to watch over him for the rest of his life. Thus, he took his knife, mixed some dried herbs, and tattooed that symbol on his forearm. And since then, meeting him was another proof of it. He genuinely felt that luck always had a way to find him when he needed her the most. Kekeli smiled and removed his tunic. On his chest, the king saw a much more detailed tattoo of the face of a woman smiling. The king looked at Kekeli in astonishment and said, "You've met her too?" Kekeli nodded and said, "Her name is Egosu." And he then proceeded to tell him about his story, where he came from, the sacrifice of his parents, and the encounter with the goddess of fortune. He told the king that she was the one who saved his life and taught him everything he knew, including the rules of luck, the rules of speech, and the way to live with pride. Regarding the rules of luck, Egosu told him that she fed on the positive energy of the world. That anytime and anywhere someone was being good to himself or was doing good to others, the smiles and the positive energy that came from those interactions was food for her. She roams the earth assuming many faces and many forms throughout time and countries in search of the most delicious feasts. The more intense the positive energies that came from an action, either from an individual or a group of people, the more delicious her meals were. And as she feasted on the positive energies released by men, she blessed them in their generations with luck and good fortune. From ancient times, it was a mutually beneficial and equal relationship. She was there when his parents willingly gave themselves to erase the misfortunes of the villagers. The show that day was glorious and the feast delicious, and according to the rule, he will thus enrich all the good luck and fortune that came from his parents' actions. As long as he did not deplete his stock of good luck and fortune by feeling negative feelings and making others feel negative feelings, his stock of good luck and fortune will keep on growing and manifesting in his life whenever it was needed. She also said that the universe of the gods was kind of like a veil on top of the human worlds, and that both could never be mixed, but there was a loophole. If a human knew the face of a god and drew that face onto his body, or sculpted that face onto any object, that face and its supports became a window, a catalyst from which the god could be in a deeper communion with the person. That was the reason he had tattoo on his chest. That was the reason he had that tattoo on his chest. And that was also the reason why, by pure luck, the king felt that good fortune could always find him when he needed her the most. The king was listening, fascinated by everything he was hearing. Kekele continued saying that from his birth to meeting Egosu, he never spoke. It's not that he didn't have anything to say, quite the contrary. He felt that words were arts and could be used to shape so many things. However, more often than not, he felt that people use words for destructions, not for creation. And for the deep love that he had for words, he feared that by speaking, he might one day commit a crime with his words. Egosu smiled, pointed to her chest, and said, Egosu. He opened his mouth and repeated the words, Egosu. And as his first word came out of him, he bursted into tears because that sacred word gave him the permission to speak. Egosu taught him that indeed truth was in silent contemplation, but to live is to use words to shape life, and not speaking was abdicating one's power to create. For words do more good than harm. For words to do more good than harm, 3 simple rules can be followed. First, before you speak, ask yourself, is what I'm about to say necessary? Second, is what I'm about to say true? Third, is what I'm about to say kind? As we filter the words that will come out of our mouth through those 3 gates, many words that would have otherwise harmed or either never spoken or said differently. She also said that words mold perception, and perception is reality. Therefore, one should really think about what feelings one's words will create in the mind of the individual, or people listening, because each one of us are responsible for the words we bring into the world. Among many other things, she taught him the importance of living with pride. Pride being defined as the honest satisfaction that comes from having done the utmost best one can with the faith that one was given, and said with a strange smile, "Gods are prisoners of their own perfection, and watching your human lives is all the entertainment we get." Kekeli ended the story saying, "One night, after spending many months with him, he woke up and Egosu had disappeared. On the ground of the hut where they lived was written, 'Don't try to find luck. Live with pride and luck will find you.' The gods live with pride and luck will find you. The gods are always watching." Even though he was very sad about it, he was expecting that moment and had already made peace with it. He got up, packed his bag and started walking forwards, wondering how, today, he could make someone smile. Since then, he has been roaming the land as a traveling healer and a craftsman, contributing everywhere he could into bringing hope and happiness into people's hearts. The king's people were undoubtedly amazed by Kekeli's talents, but they could not understand the origin of that strange affection that the king had for him. Nonetheless, when they returned to the village, they were welcomed as heroes, and thanks to them, the famine was averted. For those simple minds, that was more than enough. Kekeli agreed to follow the king to his village and decided that he could settle there for some time. After all, something profound united them. It's been many years now since the day he decided to temporarily settle in the village. Now, there he was today, a general seated at the king's table and requested to give his opinion on how to win a war that was brought to their doors. For the last decades, the whole of the northern region was under the iron rule of a ruthless queen. Some years ago, her small village came out of the darkness and took the whole region by surprise. Her expansionist ambitions were strong, and she preferred complete control over collaboration. Within a short period of time, her warriors were able to seize control of the main villages within the region and annex them into her dream of a kingdom. It was said that during the years of misfortune that the region suffered many years ago, her village was the most affected, but almost overnight, and for no explainable reason, things started to change for the better. The livestock started to give birth to stronger and more resistant animals, and uncommon weather phenomena started happening, which benefited the soil and the crops, as well as many other favorable events. It was definitely a period of abundance for her village, and also the period she ascended to the throne after the death of the king during questionable circumstances. Since the king did not have any son to succeed him, the next male within the king's lineage should have been the one to ascend to the throne. However, she expertly manipulated the minds of the people and seized the throne. She was feared by many and revered by some, but everyone knew her as the cursed queen. For decades now, she had disrupted the stability of the region through her wars of conquests and by forcing the ruling families of every conquered village to pay a huge tax to her if they wanted to keep their seats. However, there is always a time that comes when oppressive rulers are faced with a few courageous ones determined to put an end to their rules, and this time, the spearhead of the resistance was King Togbechali's village. Kekeli has been instrumental in organizing the effort of the resistance, so much so that under his command, more than half of the village under the queen's rule were freed. However, The remaining villages were the stronghold that would not fall easily. Thus, the goal of the current meeting was to elaborate the most optimal strategy to end the war quickly and with minimal losses. Earlier that week, they got information that the queen and a sizable portion of her army moved to a certain village near a forest and established their base there. As soon as they heard that, the king's army, with the support of the other members of the resistance, joined their forces and marched onto the village, hoping to catch the queen by surprise and seize the village before they could reinforce the village defenses. Unfortunately, they arrived as the last stone was being reinforced and the village gates were being tightly shut. As the gates were closing, they all knew that besieging the village as it was now would be a long and drawn-out affair. It was that night, with the other generals around. It was that night, with the other generals around, that the king turned to Kekeli and asked him if he had any suggestion to get them out of this conundrum. Since the day they arrived in front of the village, Kekeli felt a deep sense of nostalgia and belonging. From drinking the water from the nearby river, or just feeling the gentle breeze on his face, everything gave him a feeling of home. That night, as he was exploring the surrounding area, he saw in the distance the debris of a small house with a garden in the back, and suddenly it struck him with the violence of a storm. All the feelings came crashing down. This village was where he was born. This queen was the one that made him and his parents a sacrificial offering to the gods, and that house standing there in the distance was where he spent the most tender moments of his life. The emotions were overwhelming, but right at that moment, he had a vision of what needed to be done, and it was that vision that he later shared with the king to answer his question. He told the king that to get the men ready for battle, and on the next new moon, during the darkest moment of the night, he will infiltrate the village, and before noon on the fourth day, the gates of the village will be open, and the king's army will have an opportunity to attack. Obviously, the king wasn't expecting that answer. However, he had faith that Kekeli was the child most favored by the goddess of fortune, and for him, nothing should be impossible. Thus, he nodded, extended his hand, and touching the tattoo on Kekeli's chest, he said, smiling, "Egosu." The night of the new moon came and Kekeli set off. He knew that the forest on the southern part of the village was the sacred forest, and he felt that to infiltrate the village successfully, he should first pass through the sacred forest, through the debris of his old house, and exactly at midnight, climb the walls of the village from that location. Kekeli always had superior eyesight during the night compared to most people. It was not that he could see clear. It was not that he could see clear as day, but he definitely saw much better than most people. And when he reached the ramparts, he saw the two guards guarding the side of the wall, deeply asleep, with a faint smell of strong wine in the air. He smiled and said, "Egosu." It was strange, but Kekeli noticed that he was feeling neither fear nor doubt regarding the outcome of his mission. He was in a total state of surrender, and he knew that he only needed to focus on the next action that needed to be done and leave the rest in the hands of the goddess of fortune. After exploring the village for one full day, Kekeli saw a small temple on the eastern side of the walls that he did not remember in his memories, and decided to inspect it. The air in the temple was cool and the light was dim. The whole atmosphere was serene and comforting. He noticed 3 pedestals arranged in a triangle in the center of the room. and on each, respectively, the statuettes of a turtle, a cowrie, and two intertwined hearts. The sight of those three talismans made him smile as he remembered that fateful day when his mother was giving them to the fierce little princess, Mawena. He sat on a mat on the floor, his eyes fixated on the three talismans, lost in thoughts, wondering among other things what had become of the fierce little princess. As he was staring at the talisman, he noticed a woman walking hurriedly toward him, both hands clasped tightly around her chest with a deep look of fear in her eyes. When she got to him, she knelt down to the level of his face, extended her hand to touch his cheek, but stopped a few millimeters from it. She said, "Kekeli." He smiled and said, "Mawena." She bursted into something that was neither tear or laughter, but was beyond both. It was as if a great dam that was holding the full expression of her life for so long has suddenly burst. Mawena was coming back to life for a second time, and it was a glorious sight. They sat there, holding each other's hand and staring in each other's eyes for a very long time. Mawena was the one to break the silence. "You have a beautiful voice." Kekeli replied, smiling, "Thank you." And he bowed his head and pressed his lips on Mawena's hand and added, "And thank you for that day." He then raised his head and said, "There are many things that need to be said. You go first." They've talked for hours, a little bit about their past, but mainly about the current situation. Both were very pragmatic people, and they knew they would have time after to talk about the past if they could solve the problem of the present. It was the second day after the infiltration. Mawena had become an influential figure within the village, and she represented, although secretly, a faction of people that were against the queen's rule. Kekeli told her that he had the complete trust of King Tagwechali, and as long as they could find a way to open the gates, the king will march into the village, but as long as there is no resistance, no unnecessary blood will be shed. Mawena trusted Kekeli completely and agreed to the deal. Since she knew that the guards watching over the ramparts rotated at dawn every day, she managed to obtain the list of guards for the next rotation. That evening, she gave the instruction to several of her top girls to find a way to meet each of those guards, seduce them, lure them away, and when they were alone, drug them. She then made sure to have on standby soldiers completely loyal to her who, the next morning, will replace the previous one. Next, she knew that the commander in charge of the ramparts will find it suspicious if he noticed that all the guards that should be on duty that morning did not come to assume their posts. The commander had many wives, and her most beloved wife was also one of Mawena's good friends and supporters. Mawena sent for her and told her about the plan to which she agreed. When her husband comes back that night, she will give him such a good time that he won't be able to wake up the next morning. Lastly, Mawena requested a meeting between her, Kekeli, and one of the queen's commanders that was covertly part of the faction against the queen. He was already a young man when Kekeli's parents sacrificed themselves for the village and vividly remembered that day. He was in shock as he was told Kekeli's identity and quickly agreed to the plan. Thus, the next morning, when the commander of the ramparts will not show up to the queen's morning meeting, he will volunteer himself to replace him for that day. And when everyone will be in position, exactly at noon, they would open the gate and let the king's army enter the village. So it was planned, so it was executed. On the fourth day after Kekeli's infiltration of the village, at noon, To everyone's astonishment, the guards on the rampart opened the gates, and as planned, King Togbichali and the resistance army entered the village. As that was happening, a message was also spreading throughout the village quicker than wildfire. And it was that the main general in charge of King Togbichali's army was named Kekeli, and he was the miracle child that sacrificed himself with his parents many years ago to save the village. He came back not to destroy the village, but to save it once again. The village has surrendered without any bloodshed. The events that were happening were too extraordinary to miss, and everyone, including King Togbichali, were more interested in watching how things will unfold instead of fighting each other. Everyone was anxiously waiting for the moment Kekeli would meet the queen, and a couple of hours later, it was announced that the long-awaited meeting will happen the next day at noon on the outskirts of the sacred forest. Everyone was already gathered well before the expected time. Kekeli arrived a couple of minutes before noon with Mawena walking by his side, holding a small wooden box in her hands. The queen also arrived almost at the same time. She had 3 guards escorting her, but she was not in chains. Mawena walked over to the empty space separating Kekeli and the queen, opened the wooden box, and set up on the ground a small pot made of white clay with a red ribbon around it, a jug filled with a thick and shiny liquid, and 2 small cups. The crowd jolted as if hit by a violent lightning strike, but everyone remained silent. Mawena turned to them and spoke. Our tradition states that only an individual with royal blood can ascend to the throne. However, there are exceptions, and in case an individual with a righteous cause deeply believes the current ruler is unsuitable for the position, with the consent of the people, that individual can rightfully challenge the current ruler to the lottery of fortune, Agbealoiku, and let the gods decide which one should be the next ruler. Today, a lost son of the village, savior of the people, came to ask your consent to challenge the queen for the throne. Do you, the people, give him consent to challenge the queen? The crowd answered with one voice. Yes, we give consent. Mawena then pulled out two tree barks and 2 small knives from the wooden box and gave it to each, asking them to engrave their symbols on it. When they finished engraving their symbols, Mawena requested that they hold it and asked the village elders to come and confirm themselves that first of all, each tree bark only had the symbol of its owner on it, and second of all, the pot of fortune was currently empty. The elders came and confirmed both, and only then Kekeli and the queen were permitted to put their respective tree bark into the pot of fortune. According to the tradition, it was for the current ruler to pick a name from the pot of fortune. The air was heavy with suspense, and everyone's eyes were on the queen. As she extended her hand toward the pot, it looked visibly shaking. Probably only a minute or 2 had passed, but for the crowd watching, it felt like an eternity. The queen removed her hand from the pot holding a tree bark in it. Kekeli was standing, calm and serene, as if he already knew the outcome. The queen looked at the tree bark in her hand and suddenly fell on the ground, shaking and sobbing uncontrollably. The elders rushed over to take the pots of fortune and inspect the symbol on the remaining tree bark inside it. Based on the tradition, the name that remained in the pots was the one chosen by the gods to be the next ruler, and the name that was picked was to drink the potion and enter the sacred forest to meet them for judgment. The queen had the tree bark with her symbol in her hand, and the tree bark with Kekele's symbol was the one remaining inside the pot. The crowd was ecstatic, and everyone started chanting Kekele's father's last words. The gods are always watching. The gods are always watching. As the queen was walking toward the sacred forest, Kekele felt a sudden urge to extend his gaze past her and into the trees. And there, standing between the branches, he distinctively saw a woman smiling at him. She had a white forehead with signs and symbols that seems to be sculpted in her skin. Kekele raised his hand, touched the tattoo on his chest and whispered, "Egosu, thank you." And despite the distance, he could read on the woman's lips, "Don't try to find luck. Live with pride, and luck will find you. The gods are always watching." So that was the story of Egosu. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I enjoy reading it to you. Egosu is the African goddess of luck and also a good luck charm. And I want the world to know about Egosu the same way as everyone is familiar with the good luck charms of other cultures, the rabbit fruits, horseshoes, four-leaf clovers, etc. If this story resonated with you and you want Egosu to be part of your life, I am working with a craftsman to make Egosu good luck charms. More specifically, we have handmade in Africa bronze accessories and keychains of Egosu. In the future, we will also have paintings, masks, and other good luck charms that you can carry with you or put on your walls. Please visit our website at Egosu.ca. I sincerely thank you for having given me so much of your time, and I want to leave you with a few words that I'm sure you can already guess. Don't try to find luck. Luck will find you. Live with pride, for the gods are always watching.